Hello, and welcome to my video for EDAD 701 Week 4, where this week we'll be covering a few different topics. This week we'll be looking at, again, some background knowledge, referring to some data analysis that I work with and have had experience with in my own school. We will also take a look at some of the essential areas of responsibility and roles of the Director of Instruction, more so pertaining to leading and guiding assessment practices, where we'll take a look at who aligns grading and assessment practices for my program. We'll take a look at what some of my grading and assessment practices are, and what are some my thoughts about that as it pertains to being a educational leader someday in the future. And then we'll also follow that up with looking at data-driven decision making. I'll take a look at comparing and contrasting quantitative and qualitative assessment results that help us to guide and inform instruction. And we also take a look at the effectiveness of responsive instruction and some of my thoughts on responsive instruction. And then we'll wrap it up here, coming back to our core text reflections. We'll be able to take a look at what does the nature of curriculum mean. Also take a look at a synopsis of the history of curriculum. We'll take a look at curriculum theory and how I would explain that to somebody else. And we'll take a look at what are some politics of curriculum. In this week's video, we do have a lot to cover here. We will not thoroughly get to every detail that we probably should with some of these topics, but hopefully we can go through enough material here so that everyone has an understanding of, or a better understanding of some of these topics, or some new knowledge, maybe something they haven't heard before. So but we'll start off here, section 1, and some of my background knowledge as it pertains to the topics for this week. So as always, I'll go through the questions, read them off, and then hopefully that will give some guidance as to where we're at in the video here. Starting off with question 1, do you think data analysis is a teacher's role, or should that be done by someone else and results presented to them? When we're using data in our schools, well, there's a lot of people that are going to use that data. Even if a teacher, it's not their role to analyze data, they're still going to have access to it. And I personally believe that is probably the best way to work with data in our schools. And the reasoning for that is teachers already have a lot on their plate. And we're going to see some of that stuff as we go through the discussion here today. I know they're constantly working with parents, students, grading assignments, working with the curriculum, developing lesson plans, collaborating with their administrators, with their peers. You know, teachers are all over the place and they have a lot on their plate already. If we tell them, now you're going to be in charge of analyzing the data, that's another thing on their plates that, could be overwhelming for many individuals. And when we're working with data analysis, we have to be sure that when we analyze the data, that we are analyzing it thoroughly and accurately. Because if we're not, then the results we come up with are going to be skewed and not accurate, and therefore they're not going to be benefiting the students and our schools the way they need to. So, I do believe that should be done by somebody else, someone in a leadership role or some sort of data team. And then they give the results to the teachers, who then use those results and use those numbers to, go from there and continue collaborating with others and making the best informed decisions that way. But I do believe it's too much to just give it as an additional responsibility to a teacher. So I would not do that personally. I'll kind of combine questions 2 and 3 here. Who taught you how to analyze and use data as an educator, and how effective was the guidance you received? So with my time working here with ChanceLight, a lot of the data that we use comes from the districts that we partner with. So when a student gets referred to our therapeutic day program, we're sent their IEPs and we're sent any other data or information that is relevant to the student, things that we need to know, their strengths and weaknesses, how they've performed throughout their school. So when I analyzed that data, I didn't really have anybody who taught me how to look at that information and to make decisions based on it. So um, it's been this past school year was a little bit different for me as I was doing my director of special education practicum. So I was more hands-on with administration and um, getting more details of this paperwork. So this last year, I was really able to work more closely with my director of special education and looking at the referral paperwork, looking at the data, and discussing and analyzing it with my director of SPED. So this last school year, I did a lot of analyzing one-on-one with my director. Before then, when I was, my previous years of teaching as a special education instructor, uh, the data was given to me, and then it was up to me to, analyze it and, any accommodations, modifications to the work and to the curriculum was left up to my discretion. So I know in some ways that's beneficial. I think a lot of us as teachers like to have that freedom to, modify, adapt, or create curriculum in the ways that, we know our students best. However, being a new teacher, at times it was a little overwhelming to look at the paperwork and the data. Those of us who work in special education know that sometimes the paperwork we receive can be 70, 80, 90, 100 pages long. Um, there's a lot to look at. There's charts, there's graphs, there's tables, everywhere in there. And even though colleges prepare you for the stuff and you work with it, it's always a little bit different when you're at the job site. You know, no longer was I a student at the University of Northern Illinois. I was a special education teacher in charge of observing this data, analyzing it, and then implementing it into the classroom. So a different experience. Um, I would have liked a little more guidance to know how we use that information, how we break it down. Um, and part of that also falls on me. I could have reached out to some other teachers a little more than I did, or my director, and asked for some more guidance. So um, the guidance I did receive when I received it, people were other teachers, the administrators were, willing to help, wanted to help. So, um, I personally felt I did a good job with taking in that data, analyzing it, and then implementing it in the classroom. Um, but the guidance I received when I needed it, when I asked for it, I thought it was thorough. What would you do differently when you take the lead? I kind of touched on that just a little bit here, these last couple questions. I would really make sure that for any new teachers, whether they're first year teachers or teachers new to my program or my district, that I'm making sure they know how to analyze the data. They know what the numbers mean. They know what all these charts and graphs are trying to tell them, because across different districts and across different states, some of that data is going to look a little bit differently. Different schools are going to use different assessments, use different tools to measure student strengths and weaknesses. There's not one uniform and universal measurement that schools across the country use. So this information can appear differently to others depending on how new they are to the district, what their past experiences have been. So, I would take time to work with these teachers, set up a mentor teacher with them to kind of help and guide them, collaborate with them, and just to make sure they understand, what they're looking at and how they need to use that data, to make informed decisions on the curriculum used for our students. How is data used in your current district? I've also kind of touched on this as we've gone through the previous questions here, but um, at Chance Light in my therapeutic day program, Our data is used to then identify where the student has strengths, where the student has weaknesses, and how we can use those strengths and weaknesses, to modify and adapt our curriculum to best meet the needs of the students and learners in our classroom. So, um, one problem that I've run into with the Chance Light is sometimes the information we get from our partnering districts is outdated. Uh, for example, this last school year was the 2021-2022 school year. Some of the information I got on a couple of my students were from testing results or data results from 2 school years prior. And I know with remote learning and COVID recently affecting us the last couple of years that some of this data um, either got lost or was the progression was slowed down. But um, I one thing that I think is very important is having up-to-date data. We can't have data that's 2, 3, 4 years old still trying to be relevant for students in the present day. So if we have a student who's in the 9th grade and they're being referred to us here at Chancelight, I don't necessarily want to see data from when they were in 6th and 7th grade as the primary focus in the paperwork I'm looking at. Need up-to-date data. Uh, that's one thing I've noticed some of the districts we work with is the data is just not always up to date. And to me, that is one of the most important factors because, I can't make the best informed decisions and service my students the best if the data that I have is outdated or potentially no longer accurate. On a scale of 1 to 10, how well do you know the difference between qualitative and quantitative data? If I had to rate it on a numerical scale, I would probably say a 7. And the reason for that is, I know the broad definitions of what qualitative and quantitative data are. Quantitative data is looking at, numerical figures, right? Looking at just mathematical numbers. It's more of like an X's and O's type of situation where you can see that, um, these numbers represent a certain trend, or these numbers represent growth or decline in a certain area. It's more straightforward. Qualitative data then tries to assess, maybe why certain trends are happening. Um, what is the reasoning for growth or decline in certain students' performances? What is the reasoning for if there's an increase in tier 1 or tier 2 intervention students? Why is there an increase in special education referrals? Is there something in the curriculum? Is there something in the assessments? So qualitative data is kind of looking behind the scenes and trying to figure out the why. Quantitative data is just looking purely at the results and what we have based off the student work, in our schools. And last question here, what are your thoughts on responsive education? So responsive education is a very big field and there's a lot to it. And we're going to touch on that a little bit later on here in the discussion. But responsive education, I thoroughly believe is very valuable in our schools. And the reasoning for that is responsive education is built on making connections for students and helping students to make connections with the learning that takes place in the classroom. We don't want students to just show up to the classroom and stare at the wall and the information goes in one ear, out the other. We want them to absorb the information that we're teaching them, that the curriculum is teaching them, and apply it to somewhere in their life, make a connection to somewhere outside of school even. Something they can use and will be of value to them later on in their lives or in their lives right now. So responsive education is not always an easy thing to do for instructors. Um, we don't always have the same experiences or the same connections that our students do. So it can be a difficult thing to implement in the classrooms, but it is important. And if we can find ways to include that in our curriculum, we absolutely need to, because it does benefit the student learning experience. So that kind of wraps up section 1, some of the background knowledge, some of my thoughts on some of the topics for this week. Section 2 here, we'll take a look at some leading and guiding assessment practices. So question number 1 here, who in your district aligns grading and assessment practices that support learning for all students? So working at my therapeutic day program at Chancellor, I'm going to be entering my practicum for Director of Instruction this upcoming fall semester, so I will get a better inside look into our grading and assessment practices, but I know that is done by our curriculum and instruction departments. That is composed of a few different individuals. At my current location with the Chancellor Education Center, we have multiple therapeutic day programs spread out across the state and also spread out across the different couple areas of the country as well. So the curriculum and instructional department, getting composed of a few different individuals who work with all of our different districts and all of our different programs to ensure that our grading and assessment practices are standards aligned. As we know, those standards might change from state to state, district even to district in some degree. So it is the curriculum department and those individuals that work in there who are constantly assessing our practices in the classroom. They're looking at the grading practices, and making sure that whatever we are doing in the classroom does support learning for the students. And as I mentioned, I will get a better inside look into that throughout this next year here. Tell me about what your grading and assessment practices are. At Chancellor, our grading and assessment practices, we just use a standard grading scale that's been around for a very, very long time. I was trying to think of the exact year, but cannot recall. But we use the 0 to 59 is failing, the 60 to 69D, 70 to 79C, and so on, so on. So we use a standard grading scale. The assessment practices, I have a couple thoughts on the assessment practice that we use at Chancelite. One thing that Chancelite does that I'm not sure I fully endorse or support is with our assessment practices, things like final exams or unit tests, unit quizzes, those are weighted more heavily in the grade book than the everyday work sometimes is. And that's also kind of been a standard practice as well, where unit tests or exams are weighted heavier. I'm not sure that services students the best way. Multiple studies have shown that not every student is a good test taker, for example. Courses don't always give us the best look into what a student has actually learned or how they can apply their knowledge. So that assessment practice there, I wish it was more even across the board, where the day-to-day work had a little bit of heavier or equal weight, at least, to our unit quizzes, unit tests, and so on. So I think that might be something to bring up with my curriculum and instruction department as I go through my practicum this year, and try to figure out why that's the practice that we use at Chancellor. Who in your district facilitates and reports continuous improvement efforts to your Board of Education? So that job would fall with my therapeutic day program. That would be my Director of Special Education, who facilitates and reports that improvement to our partnering districts. So um, we work with our partnering districts and we send them information every week on Fridays about the students from their district who are currently in our program. Where the progress has been, what their grades are, and that progress going back for a second refers to not just academics, but social, emotional, all sorts of growth and development. Um, and we work with those districts to, provide them the information they need, make sure they have the information they want, and if there's anything specifically they're looking for, that we can, get that to our teachers and make sure we're servicing our students in the way that our partnering districts, want their students to be serviced. Tell me about how the evaluation process works. With evaluation, the evaluations are done by the director of special education here at the program, and she uses the drawing a blank on the name of the evaluation, but it is a common evaluation tool that has been around for decades and decades. Recently, this past school year, we had a new instructor in our program, and she has been working in education for 35 years now. So, very experienced teacher. And I talked to her throughout the year, and she said, the evaluation processes that were used in our school were the same as she's always seen throughout her entire career. So we don't do anything unique or special as far as those evaluation processes go, but they are done by the director of special education and they are shared with the staff in the school. And then some collaboration is done, between teachers and then the teachers and administrators to um, identify strengths and weaknesses, identify areas of growth, and identify an area of professional goals as well, and what we can do to work on those. Again, to service our growth as educators, as well as continue to service the students in our building. What excites or worries you about these roles as you potentially take the reins? Um, what the grading and assessment practices, some of the things that one thing that potentially excites me is if I do have the ability to, um, work with these assessment practices to ensure that, that again, the day-to-day work of the students is not being lost in the process. I don't want our assessment practices to just be a comprehensive exam that students take at the end of a unit, and that unit exam can either make or break a student. I don't believe that should ever be the case. The day-to-day learning of those, 3, 4, 5 week units, should play a heavy role in how the grading is done and how we're assessing their learning and their growth, or assessing their needs for improvement or interventions. So if I have the opportunity to, know, uh, change some of those practices, that is something that excites me. The same time, I guess I would be worried that if some of these assessment practices or some of these grading practices are not seen eye to eye between myself and other teachers or other leaders, how can I work with them to um, help them see where I'm coming from, how I think this benefits students, or also keeping my mind open as well. Perhaps I'm not thinking correctly about it. Perhaps I need a different viewpoint myself. So I don't know if worry is the right word there, but just making sure that I'm keeping an open mind to all practices, and I'm not being closed off or um, being closed-minded about anything myself. As a section 3 here, we will look at defining data-driven decision making. We will compare and contrast quantitative and qualitative assessment results to inform instruction. And we will also assess the effectiveness of responsive instruction. So starting with a data-driven decision making, we have a couple things we can take a look at here. I apologize for the delay. I am attempting to share my screen and the option is not popping up the way it needs to. I will come back to that in a moment and try to share my screen here with you, but we are taking a look here at some information. It talks about some of the components of data-driven decision making. So there are 5 main components that we look at when we're looking at data-driven decision making. And these 5 components are theoretical capacity, organizational capacity, process capacity, technological capacity, and professional capacity as well. So let's kind of go through these 5 components here, talk about what that means, and how we use all of these to uh, inform our data-driven decision making. So the theoretical component emphasizes the dynamics, the interconnectedness, and commitment of complex school systems. The organizational capacity component focuses on data usage culture and describes the structures that block and support data usage culture. Leadership, quality professional development, time recognition for data research and use, and collaboration among educators are essential for a culture of data usage. A couple key terms that stick out to me here is collaboration. This is something that we have talked about a lot in previous discussions, whether they are these assignments or our discussion posts. But collaboration is always going to be a central focus in anything that we do in our schools. Whether we're looking at curriculum, we're looking at our grading practices, our assessment practices, we're looking at how we assess data. Collaboration is always going to be there and is always going to be necessary. But the theoretical component is looking at, as it mentions here, our culture of data usage. So how are our schools, how are our teachers, how are our educational leaders using data? Um, and again, we're going to get that through the examples from our leaders and their leadership. If teachers see directors or administrators who don't use data, don't care about data, they may be less likely to care about it or use it themselves. So it starts with leadership and us in those leadership positions showing the importance of data and using it accurately and efficiently. It's also going to be part of our quality professional development. We've also talked a little bit about professional development as well. But when we're using data and analyzing data and assessing data, we're going to need professional development on these topics. Data changes throughout the years. Different assessments are used, different data is available to us. So it's important for us to keep ourselves and our teachers and our school staff up to date on the best practices of using data. Time recognition for data research and use. Just making sure that we give sufficient time when we're analyzing this data. We're not just glossing over it or skimming through it, but we're taking a look at the data in front of us and truly understanding what it's saying and what it is telling us. And then collaboration, which we have talked about many times here. Again, just continuing to work with our teachers and teachers to administrators, administrators to administrators, but making sure that all of us work together, creating that interconnectedness between our school faculty to ensure everybody knows the importance of data, how to analyze it, how to use it, and why it's important. The process capacity component includes the use of data that turns into information and activates it in accordance with its purpose in the decision-making process. Data can be used as a tool to explore a school's strengths and weaknesses in education and make the right decisions by focusing on changes in problem solving. Excuse me. Studies have found that data are used to manage school resources, to improve teaching practices and accountability, to make professional development planning, and to help individual decisions, as well as to help make informed decisions. This last key right here is the one that really sticks out to me, is making informed decisions, something I have mentioned multiple times today already, something I've mentioned in the past, and something I will continue to mention going forward in the future. But when we make decisions in schools, whether it's our teaching practices, whether it's our curriculum, whether it's how we view the strengths and weaknesses or trends of our students, we have to make these decisions with the information and data in front of us. We cannot make these decisions about our students, about our teachers, based on whims or gut feelings or thoughts or feelings. It has to be done with data to back up our decisions, to support our decisions and support the claims that we're making in our schools. The technological capacity component defines the various characteristics of technological tools such as data warehouses, student information systems, evaluation systems, and instructional management systems and their impact on the data process. So like technological capacity just refers to our databases. Again, that's the data warehouses, our student information systems, our evaluation systems, and instructional management systems and their impact on the data process. So um, as it goes on to mention here as well, this component includes accessibility, feedback, flexibility. These are all characteristics of data collected from our system. So I'm just making sure that uh, the information in our technology and in our data, is including all the necessary components that we find within our schools. Uh, the professional capacity components includes the ability of educators to have the attitude, knowledge, and professional capacity to extract meaning from data. The knowledge and skills needed to read and understand data are defined in the literature as data literacy. So, professional capacity just refers to our teachers and administrators and others within the building being able to look at that data and understand what it means and how we're going to use it to improve student learning, to create positive trends within our classroom, and to make sure that we are using best practices and informed decision making within our schools. And this will go back to using professional developments to ensure that members in our school building are aware and are up to date on these practices. So data driven decision making encompasses a lot of things within our schools, especially in today's day and age where we have access to more data than we've ever had before. So that is, as we go through the years, is going to be even more important every single year, every month, to make sure that we are using the data we have to make informed and best decisions for our students. Compare and contrast quantitative and qualitative assessment results to inform instruction. And we also have some information on that as well. When we're using quantitative and qualitative data or approaches, I've always believed that it's best to use a mixture of both of these approaches. We don't want to be caught using just quantitative approaches where we're simply looking at the numbers and then moving on from there. We also don't want to just use qualitative data and ignore the information in front of us. We want to use both of these and mix these two things together to ensure that we're getting the best of both worlds and and to ensure that we are making the best decisions, possible. We have some information here. The use of both quantitative and qualitative approaches might be sometimes desirable too. For instance, when a researcher wants to generalize the findings to a population and develop a detailed view of the meaning of a phenomenon or concept for individuals, the advantages of collecting both closed-ended quantitative data and open-ended qualitative data um, support to best understand a research problem. A mixed methods approach might possess several other benefits. It provides rich insights into various phenomena that cannot be fully understood by using only qualitative or quantitative methods. Collecting diverse types of data provides an understanding of a research problem. So for me, that really is the key here, is, as they mention and hammer it home here. Um, we are getting new insights, and we also um, receiving the best data when we have a mixture of qualitative and quantitative approaches to our schools, and when we're looking at the data within our schools. I don't want to be caught up in doing things one particular way or one set way, or coming to a decision where, things have always been done this way, so I'm going to do it this way. If we want to fully understand a problem and to understand the numbers in front of us and to understand the hows and the whys of how we've come to certain decisions, how we've arrived at certain ends, we have to try and fully understand as much um, of this problem or of these assessments, and we can only do that, I believe, the mixed methods approach. And this information was provided from, uh, our quantitative and qualitative approaches to educational research compatible from Saraswati and Dwadi. And lastly, we will assess the effectiveness of responsive instruction. So we talked about responsive instruction a little bit earlier. Responsive instruction, this is a topic that you could probably cover just by itself in an entire week. There's a lot of information that goes in here, but as we mentioned earlier as well, responsive curriculum and responsive practices are going to refer to helping students make connection to their lives, taking the things they learn in the classroom and applying it to an aspect of their life, whether that's past, current, or potentially even in the future as well. This helps our students best absorb and best use the knowledge in a meaningful way. We also have culturally responsive practices and curriculum as well. As our schools become more diverse as the years go by, being culturally responsive is going to be critically important to our schools, to our educational leaders, to our teachers, to the environments that we create in the classrooms, in the hallways, in the school buildings, and ultimately in our community. So I just wanted to touch on culturally responsive practices and curriculums here for just a moment. Gay believed that curriculum content can empower students if the knowledge students acquire is accessible to them and meaningful for their lives outside of school. Content about the histories, heritage, contributions, perspectives, and experiences of different ethnic groups and individuals taught in diverse ways is essential to culturally responsive teaching. Textbooks continue to be prominent teaching tools, as most students consider textbooks incontestable sources of information. When conducting um, a curriculum analysis, Sleater and Grant found that textbooks were dominated by European Americans as they conformed to their status, culture, and contributions. This is something that we have seen very commonly throughout textbooks throughout the years. A lot of textbooks that we use sometimes in our schools are textbooks that were written how many years or even potentially decades ago. When we're working with the students in our schools, we're using these textbooks and our curriculums. We want to make sure that our curriculum and our instruction encompasses all learners within our school building. Um, as I mentioned, we continue to grow in our diversity within our schools. Those of Spanish descent or African American descent or um, Asian descent are not going to be able to make the same connections with materials in their textbooks as those of European Americans. We have to make sure that when we are teaching in our schools, that our responsive practices include things that are going to be accessible and meaningful to the lives of all students in our classrooms. We're going to service all of our students and we're going to have the best practices within our schools. Those things are going to be of the utmost importance as well. This past school year, we did a unit on Spanish Heritage Month, where we looked at all the different countries um, located in Spanish countries. And we looked at some of the histories of them. We looked at their heritages, their contributions to American society. We also do this in Black History Month as well, where we take a look at African American figures, their histories, heritages, contributions. But one thing about that I want to touch on as well briefly is, um, while it's important we have these heritage months and we recognize the importance and the contributions of others around us, we should try to just not limit those to just once a month activities. We should try to include these throughout the entire school year. Um, Otherwise, some of these students see these things as, um, my culture is only important during the month of February, or my culture is only important during the month of September or October. We want to include these practices throughout our entire school year so that students are always making connections and always feel that they are making meaningful connections back to their lives as well. In our last session here, we will go back to our core text reflections. We'll take a look at what the nature of curriculum means. We'll provide a synopsis of the history of curriculum, and we will explain what curriculum theory is. And I'll take a look at what are some of the politics of curriculum. This last section here is going to encompass a large area of content. So I apologize if there is a particular piece of information that is missed, but I will do my best to try and cover the things that are of the most importance in regard to the questions here. So we're looking at the nature of curriculum. What exactly does that mean? For me, I will also provide a definition from our textbook here in just a moment, but if we're looking at the nature of something, if we're studying the nature outside around us, what are we looking at? We're looking at its past, we're looking at its present, and we're looking at how that's going to affect the future. We're looking at what's involved in nature. Who are the inhabitants? What's going on in the day-to-day operations? How are these affecting individuals in the community? Those are things you look at when we're looking at nature. When we're looking at the nature of curriculum, we're looking at the same things as well. What has been the past of our curriculum? Um, how has that led us to where we're at now? And where might that lead us going forward in the future? But the definition provided by our textbook is the curriculum is a set of plans made for guiding learning in the schools, usually representative and retrievable documents of several levels of generality and the actualization of those plans in the classroom, as experienced by the learners and as recorded by an observer. Those experiences take place in a learning environment that also influences what is learned. So what exactly does all of that mean? They provide a little bit more of a thorough explanation down below. Several points in this definition need to be emphasized. First, it suggests that curriculum includes both a set of plans made for learning and the actual learning experiences. Limiting the term to the plans made for learning is not enough because, as will be discussed next, those plans are often ignored or modified. We see that all the time in our education as well. We can have a plan in place for our curriculum. However, that doesn't mean it's going to be followed strictly to the T. And we've talked about this in our curriculum design and um, our curriculum units throughout the years that it's important to keep in mind that these are flexible. They are not rigid and set in stone. If you stray off the path a little bit, it's okay. So when they're talking about these plans being ignored or modified, that's what they're referring to there. But second, the term retrievable documents is sufficiently broad in its denotation to include curricula stored in a digital form, that is, software and or shared on the internet. Also, those documents, as will be more fully explained next, are several levels of specificity. Some, such as curricular policy statements, are very general in their formulation. Others, such as daily lesson plans, are quite specific. So when we're talking about the retrievable documents, that's going to encompass a lot of different things. As it mentions here, those could be the policy statements within a school, such as found in the school code of conduct or parent-student handbooks. And it could also include daily lesson plans. So retrievable documents are going to kind of be the paperwork or the online paperwork for which our schools base their policies, their reasonings, and the day-to-day operations within the building. And third, the definition notes two key dimensions of actualized curriculum. The curriculum as experienced by the learner and that which might be observed by a disinterested observer. Finally, the experienced curriculum takes place in an environment that influences and impinges on learning, constituting what is usually termed the hidden curriculum. So this last section here talks about the learner and the observer. So the curriculum as experienced by the learner being the students in this case, what is the curriculum teaching them? What are students learning from the curriculum? What is the goal of the curriculum? And that's going to go back to those state and priority standards that kind of guide us along the way to show us, what is the purpose of this curriculum? What are we trying to teach our students? What do students need to know? What should they know? And what are they going to know at the end of the unit of instruction? These next couple here, I'll kind of combine into one question because I believe there is some crossover between them. I'll provide a synopsis of the history of curriculum. And how would you explain curriculum theory to another? So the history of curriculum is a very long and very intense and comprehensive topic. We will go through some of the histories of them, some of the time periods, some of the thoughts and foundational principles throughout these different academic periods here. So our first one, the academic scientism from 1890 to 1916. The term used here to identify the period from 1890 to 1916, academic scientism, derives from the two influences that seem to predominate the academic and the scientific. The academic influence was the result of a systematic and somewhat effective efforts of the colleges to shape the curriculum for basic education. The scientific influence resulted from the attempts of educational theorists to use newly developed scientific knowledge in making decisions about the mission of the school and the content of the curriculum. So In the early stages of our schools and of our curriculums and the history of our schools and curriculums, uh, we are kind of trying to lay the foundations of, what is the purpose or what is the mission of our schools and what is going to be taught in the schools. What do students need to know? What students should be learning, how they're going to learn it. That refers to the content of the curriculum there. But some of the predominant trends during this period, the academic period was the result of educational theorists who wanted to use their newly developed scientific knowledge to make decisions about the mission of the school and the content of the curriculum. That's very similar to what we just read here, but again, um, these educational theorists really just trying to lay the foundation of what curriculum in schools is going to look like, what it was going to be, and what the purpose of curriculum was, and how it was going to service students now and also going forward in the future as well. And some of these purposes and some of these um, ideas that came from all the way back over 100 years ago now are still relevant today, as is the case here. Today, in most public high schools, course credits are still largely based on the 120-hour Carnegie unit standard. So even that 120 credit hours that, as I mentioned here, most high schools use that. In my district, in my partnering district in the Rockford public school system, we use an adaptation of that as well. But some of those foundations and ideas, are still present to today's learning. Next, we come to progressive functionalism. The area of progressive functionalism, which lasted from approximately 1917 to 1940, was characterized by the confluence of two seemingly disparate views: the progressive child-centered orientation of the followers of John Dewey and the functional orientation of curriculum scientists. So we have progressivism and we have functionalism as two kind of the big ideas here for a period of 23 years. But progressivism in education. Whereas in the prior decade, the dominating influence of the curriculum was the academic subject, for progressive educators, it was the child. So in progressivism in education, that really was child-centered curriculum. Workers begin by determining the child's interest, assured that any desired content can be leaked with those interests. And we still see some remnants of this progressivism thinking here today, where we look at, making connections for students and helping students make connections with the curriculum to their everyday lives. So that line of thinking is certainly still around today. And we see many schools and many methods of curriculum and units of instruction that are student-centered and focused on gauging student interest and building upon those interests to foster learning. We also had functionalism as well during this period, which stated that curriculum should be derived from an analysis of the important functions or activities of adult life. Taylor argued that any task could be analyzed for optimal efficiency by observing skilled workers, studying the operations they carried out, determining the time required, and eliminating wasted motion. Similarly, education can be made more efficient by analyzing learning tasks. So a little bit different from the student-centered curriculum that we were just talking about earlier with progressivism. Functionalism more so focuses on having students observe and learn through observation. So this might benefit students who are visual learners, for example. In today's world, I believe a good example of this would be, using the technology we have to show videos, to do 3D models, maybe using virtual reality technology to help visual learners by observing um, the material, observing the curriculum that way. But the two predominant trends um, during this era shaped educational efforts in the area of developmental conformism. The interest in the developmental abilities and needs of youth, and a concern with conformity as an educational goal. And I apologize, I skipped over that. That is the next period here, which is developmental conformism. The next period of educational history, the area of developmental conformism, might be seen as a transition period. The nation first embroiled in a cataclysmic war and then recovered from it to find a Cold War on its hands. So this era, um, within not just our schools, but also our country as well, was a very difficult area to navigate. This is when we were just coming off the biggest war in the history of the world. We had just developed the first atomic bomb, which was a world shattering event. And then right after World War II, there's really no breathing room as we jump right into the Cold War. And, the fear of the USSR and, some of their ideologies, seeping into American culture, uh, big fear of that as well, and that affecting not only the adults in our country, but the youth as well. So, this era of our schools, I believe is quite a bit different than some of the previous eras we've looked at, and then some of the eras we'll look at going forward. But it is perhaps not unfair to say that such a strong emphasis on conformity was both a reflection and a contribution to prevailing educational view that held that one of the important responsibilities of the schools was to help children and youth conform to existing societal norms. Uh, One of the issues, and perhaps the biggest issue I take with that line of thinking is, um, first of all, societal norms are going to be somewhat different for many individuals across the country, depending on your heritage, depending on your ethnicity, depending on your cultures and customs. Your societal norms might be vastly different than that of someone next to you. So, schools focusing on conforming children to certain societal norms is a very gray area and very hard to do. That American dream might look different for every kid in the classroom. But as well, as we know, societal norms change as time changes and passes as well. Now, certainly the societal norms from this era in the 1940s and 1950s is much different than the societal norms in the year 2022. And we're also going to see that be true in the future as well. Our societal norms right now are probably going to be different than these societal norms 30 or 40 years from now in the future. So, um, schools that is their main focus is to shape children to certain societal norms. It's a very hard area to navigate and makes for a very, what I believe to be a rocky road in that area. So, it was a very kind of odd area of our country's history, and certainly one um, odd era, excuse me, in our schools as well. Our next session here, we have scholarly structuralism. Happening as it did during the height of the Cold War and the space race, scholarly structuralism placed particular emphasis on math and science as foundational to education. Um, what I believe is most interesting about this era is this takes place during the space race and during the height of it, as it mentioned in our textbook here. And during the space race, as we know, rocket technology was really the forefront of everything that a lot of countries around the world were doing. The United States, the USSR, even Middle Eastern countries, China, Japan. Everyone was interested in this rocket technology. And rocket technology, as it mentions as well, was primarily focused on math and science. Those are seen as the foundations to our educational institutions and to our societies as well. Um, that's not to say that things like ELA and history and other forms of science were not important, but um, math and like engineering science and space science, really took the front and center here. And um, a problem with that is, math and science are critically important to our society and to our schools. However, we can't just place too much emphasis on, one or two subject areas and then not give enough focus to the overall broader picture of what our schools need to be as well. So, um, it's a very interesting time period there. And I was I was dominated primarily, from the Cold War and from our interactions, with rocket and space technology. We had the Romantic Radicalism period, which took place from 1968 to 1974. And this seemed to be a time of national fragmentation and upheaval, one in which the fabric of the society was stretched to its breaking point. This period of time was an attempt to develop child centered schools and programs. The experimentation took three related but different forms: alternative schools, which we still have around today, of course, open classrooms, which are still around today as well, and then elective programs. We'll kind of touch on each of these three areas here briefly, but this time period is really the introduction of some of these other forms or alternative education that really had not been around prior to this period. But alternative schools. Teachers often administered the schools without a principal, determining the curriculum and offering many of the support services provided by specialists in conventional schools. What's interesting about alternative schools at their inception is that is much different than it is today. I have worked in an alternative setting myself, my therapeutic day program, and um, we do have our director of special education, we have our directors of curriculum and instruction, and we have our administrative teams that work and oversee the program and make sure it is running, functioning, to state standards and optimally and efficiently as well. And that is the case of um, alternative schools across the country as well. So um, much different time period back 40, 50 years ago now, with teachers being the administrators of a school. I talked briefly in the beginning of this video about how teachers already have a lot on their plates. So this method here of teachers also leading the schools without an administrative team is kind of a hard area to navigate. Open classrooms. Teachers in the open classroom typically began by provisioning the classroom with stimulating learning materials and activities. Centers of interest would immediately appeal to the child, at the same time, help the child learn. Open classrooms we still see pretty commonly, primarily in the younger grade levels, where we might see it in pre-K, kindergarten, or even first, second, or third grade classrooms. Open classrooms are still pretty common today, where we are trying to stimulate the children through their learning materials and activities. Centers of interest, still very common. When I was a student teacher, I've worked in a self-contained autism classroom where we had students from grades K through 4, and centers of interest, for those special education students were still very much there. We very much had an open classroom that worked with the students to provide stimulation for them that ultimately built on learning as well. So This is kind of the foundation for that, and it is used in special education and primarily younger grades here today. Um, Next, we come to our privatistic conservatism. This is a time when a strong conservative philosophy permeated the national consciousness. This period was also a time when the information age fully arrived, with an emphasis on key factors for effective schools. The chief function of the school was to transmit the culture and to prepare students for their roles in a technological society. So this was a time period as well when technology really starts to first take its steps. Um, this was a time when companies like Apple, Microsoft, and Google really started to have their inceptions. And while they weren't front and center in schools like they are today, today a lot of schools have Apple technology, Google technology, Microsoft technology, and technology is such a huge part of our lives today. This is really um, the base and the inception of um, the technological society and technological world that was to come. So, um, in accomplishing such a mission, the curriculum would emphasize the scholarly disciplines, characterized by intellectual rigor and closely monitored for its effectiveness. Emanating from this broadly conservative view of the school and its curriculum were several specific trends, which were school effectiveness and school reforms, a more rigorous curriculum, and the critical thinking movement. This concern for a new rigor in the curriculum also took the form of widespread interest in teaching critical thinking. Most of those in the forefront of the movement argued for the importance of critical thinking by stressing the need for more logical analysis in a technology-oriented information age. And certainly that statement right there we still see as true and relevant to our schools here today. Accountability as well. Accountability, although they varied in detail, they attempted to align the written and the taught curriculum, usually by monitoring what was taught and the written and tested curriculum, ordinarily by matching the test with the instructional objectives. So this really started to lay the foundation and the base for our state and priority standards, how our curriculum is shaped, how our units of instruction are carried out throughout the year. Not that we didn't have these practices in place before, but this laid a lot of the foundation for those standard practices that we use still today. Uh, and then we will come down to our technological constructionism. This is a period in which leaders sought to improve education, which they did in all these periods. That is not unique to just this one time period here. But the emergence of charter schools, technology as a catalyst for change, and a standards-based movement impacted real change in education. So charter schools, as you saw here, they increase the opportunities for learning and access to quality education for all students. They create choice for parents and students within the public school system. Creating choice is a very, very big thing for a lot of parents across the country. Before, you didn't have a lot of choice of where your student was going to go to school. With charter schools, there are all sorts of vouchers and other aspects that factor into them. But at least now some parents have the choice to send their kids elsewhere if they so desire. But the standards-based movement was the big thing that I took away from this time period. The decade of the 1990s ushered in a wave of state educational standards. All the states, with the exception of Iowa, adopted academic standards. And certainly, as we have seen through our first few weeks together here, these standards are still very relevant and still very important and the foundation of the curriculum we build in our schools today. So this is a very important and very foundational aspect that's still very relevant in our world here today. From there, we went to modern conservatism, which was an increased involvement by the federal government to raise the outcomes of public schools, primarily through the No Child Left Behind Act. It was also marked by an acceleration of school privatization. Uh, this also kind of touches on some of the last question here. What are some of the politics of curriculum? When we're looking at politics and curriculum, we'll go more into that in just a moment, but um, federal laws such as the No Child Left Behind Act are certainly related to politics. Um, the biggest public school store in the 21st century was the 1100-page No Child Left Behind Act signed into law by President George W. Bush in January of 2002. Being that it was bipartisan legislation, a congressional coalition formed around the ambitious federal educational bill. However, that unity dissolved as Democrats blamed Republicans for withholding funding, and Republicans criticized Democrats for abandoning school reform. We'll touch on some of that in more detail in just a moment, but certainly our two political parties in the country here, Republicans and Democrats, have had different ideas of the role of education in our schools, what schools are meant to be, what they should be doing. And at the federal level, that has certainly played a very large role in the history of our schools. But with No Child Left Behind specifically, the law's three main goals were to make sure that all students in a school, as well as students from low-income families, minority populations, limited English proficient students, and students with disabilities perform well in the areas of reading and mathematics. There's also to hold schools responsible if all children are not on grade level or above, and to make sure that there is a highly qualified teacher in each classroom. Today, with making sure there's highly qualified teachers in the classrooms, an example of that is uh, to become a special education teacher in the state of Illinois, I had to pass all the state exams. I had to get my LBS 1 certificate and licensure. So there are, depending on which state you live in, different exams. In Wisconsin, they do the FORT exam, as well as some others for their special education instructors. But different states use different methods to ensure that there are highly qualified teachers in the classrooms, people who are certified to be there, and people who will benefit and push forward students in the schools as well. But our last section here, talking about some of the politics of schools, we touched on that a little bit here. Getting down to it, politics in schools, that is going to be there's going to be aspects of this that are on the federal level and a much larger scale. There's also going to be aspects of it that are on the smaller and local scale as well. But nonetheless, this assault on progressive education worldwide continues. According to Toach, education across the country was clearly being directed by state agencies as well as federally mandated programs, such as the No Child Left Behind Act, Race to the Top, Response to Intervention, or RTI, and now the Every Student Succeeds Act, or the ESSA. Over the past several decades, at the local level, there has been the same interplay of conflicting and coalescing influences. Only the key actors are different. As the local school board sets general curriculum policy, it is also sensitive to prevailing trends in the society. In this context, the board makes general decisions that have been strongly influenced by the superintendent, who is responding to his or her own perception of the larger educational scene and local needs. At the same time, local pressure groups, often acting in concert with nationally organized lobbies, will attempt to influence the board's curriculum policy as it involves such specific controversial issues such as sex education, evolution, creationism, and values of education. With Politics in education. Unfortunately, that's going to be an area that is going to be around and play a large factor in our schools, for the foreseeable future, and as long as our schools are around. It's not really something that's just going to necessarily go away or not play an influence. As it mentions here, the superintendent is going to have their own views on the curriculum and what it should be doing, what the schools should be emphasizing, um, in the district. And that's going to be passed down to the school administrators and directors and educational leaders who are going to have their own views on what happens. And then that goes down to the parents in the community who are also going to have their own views and be trying to influence the educational leaders, the superintendents, and the board as well. So all of these things are constantly battling with each other, these politics and these political games, or these political influences are always going to be there, always going to be doing something in the background. Um, while students and even teachers might not see some of these influences um, playing, or playing our app play all the time. They're certainly always going to be there, and these politics can change on a whim as well. You get a new superintendent in the district who has ideas and beliefs that are drastically different than the person before him. That can shape and drastically change a school very, very quickly as well. Same thing at the federal level. We get new people in our educational departments who, depending on their political affiliation, might view schools in different ways as well. Certainly during our remote learning in our COVID time period, we saw um, a very wide array of what should be done with schools during that time period. Should there be remote learning? Should there not be remote learning? Um, what is the value of teachers? So many topics that come into play with these discussions. And they're always, as I mentioned, in the background, having some sort of influence, on the things we do, how our curriculum is shaped, um, what's required of our teachers, what's required of our districts, um, what we're looking for in our data, how we use that data to make informed decisions. So, politics always going to play a role and always going to be very present, in our schools. And as future educational leaders, it's important for us to be aware of that and to know that that's something we're going to be dealing with and working with. However, as future educational leaders, we don't want our own personal political beliefs or biases um, to allow us to make subjective decisions for our schools or for our students. We want to go back to that decision making through data and making informed and objective decisions and measures to have the best practices in place for our schools. So that will wrap up our discussion here for today. If there are any questions, anything that was missed during our the discussion, please feel free to reach out and I can address anything that needs to be addressed. Thank you.